40%. That's the number I want you to hold in your mind for the next few minutes. 40% of your pancreas's beta cells, the cells that produce insulin, the cells your metabolic survival depends on, are already gone by the time a doctor first says the word diabetes. Not after the diagnosis. Before. While you're still sitting in that office hearing the verdict for the first time, the factory has been burning for years, and no one told you. This isn't theory. This is data from the UKPDS, the largest study of type 2 diabetes conducted in the last 30 years. Half the production capacity, destroyed quietly, without symptoms, without warning lights, without any signal at all. A person walks out of their doctor's office with a metformin prescription and the feeling that something happened suddenly. But nothing happened suddenly. It had been happening for years. And medicine was watching the glucose numbers, not the factory. And here's the thing. When we treat type 2 diabetes the way most clinical protocols dictate, lower blood sugar, we are treating a symptom. We are clearing the smoke. But the fire inside the workshop keeps burning. And it occurs to no one to ask, is there a way to stop the fire itself? I spent 28 years in emergency medicine. And if you want to understand what actually happens to a person after 20 years of uncontrolled diabetes, don't read the textbooks. Walk a single shift with me through any emergency department in any large hospital. I'll show you. A 62-year-old man with an amputated foot, neuropathy did its work slowly and without mercy. He simply didn't feel it when the wound on his toe became irreversible. A 58-year-old woman in kidney failure, dialysis 3 times a week for the rest of her life. Another man, post-stroke, left side of his body unresponsive, his wife watching him the way people watch someone they have already almost lost. I'm not showing you this to frighten you. I'm showing you this because it was there, in those rooms where the final chapter of the disease gets treated, that I understood something fundamental. As a system, we have become masterful at treating consequences and almost completely abandoned the mechanism. And the mechanism is where the hope lives. Stop for a moment. I want you to picture a factory. A large production facility, let's say 1,000 workers on 3 shifts. This factory produces one critically important product, insulin. Without it, nothing functions. Every cell in your body depends on this factory. That factory is your pancreas. And those 1,000 workers are the beta cells of the islets of Langerhans, tiny clusters of tissue scattered through the pancreatic gland like islands in an archipelago. Now imagine that in one corner of the factory, a small fire has started. Not an explosion, a smoldering fire. No evacuation alarm sounds. A few workers simply stop showing up for their shifts. Then a few more. Output falls slowly, so slowly that the quarterly report still looks acceptable. Management says, nothing critical, situation under control. But the fire is never put out. It smolders. For years. That is what chronic inflammation and glucolipotoxicity look like in the context of type 2 diabetes. Not a sudden catastrophe. A slow, systematic destruction of productive capacity. By the time your blood test first shows a troubling number, 40% of the factory is already gone. Some workers have died. Others simply left, exhausted by chronic overload, poisoned by their own oxidative byproducts, suppressed by the cytokine noise that modern medicine calls metabolic inflammation. And here's what most doctors say at that point: well then, let's make the remaining workers work harder. Metformin. Sulfonylureas. Eventually, injectable insulin. We pressure what's left of the factory, demand more output. But no one puts out the fire. And no one brings in new workers. Now, what most patients don't know. And what, honestly, many physicians either don't know or don't consider important enough to bring up during a 15-minute appointment. Beta cells can regenerate. Not in everyone. Not infinitely. Not by any magical mechanism. But the process called beta cell neogenesis, the emergence of new, functional insulin-producing cells from precursors, is real, documented, and, most importantly, nutritionally stimulable. Your factory can hire new workers. Reserve trainees, precursor cells within the pancreatic tissue, can be activated under the right conditions. And some of those conditions can be created in your kitchen. Tomorrow morning. This is where fenugreek seeds enter the story. I understand how that sounds. Seeds for diabetes, and you're already preparing to close this video, because you've seen too many advertising promises on yellow websites with blurry fonts. You're probably thinking right now, if this actually worked, my doctor would already know about it. And that's a fair question. But here's the answer: your doctor likely knows about the research. But between what gets published in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology and what enters clinical protocols, decades pass. The system is slow. Not malicious. Not corrupt. Simply slow. And while the system moves at its own pace, your pancreas continues losing workers. So let me speak not about a product. Let me speak about a mechanism. Fenugreek seeds, Trigonella fenugreecum, contain a molecule called trigonelline. It's an alkaloid, and for years it was considered just one of many phytochemical components with general antioxidant properties. But in 2014, a research group at the University of Oslo did something important. They stopped looking at the effect and started looking at the mechanism. And what they found changed the way I thought about this cheap, unremarkable seed. Trigonelline activates PDX1. PDX1 is a transcription factor. If that term is unfamiliar, think of it as the master switch on the control panel. PDX1 governs the differentiation of precursor cells into mature, functional beta cells. Without it, new beta cells don't appear. With it, the process of neogenesis is initiated. Trigonelline, according to this research, reliably elevated PDX1 expression in pancreatic tissue of laboratory animals, and the effect held in cell cultures of human origin. This is not magic. This is molecular signaling. Stop for a moment. We are talking about a seed, a $5 bag in the corner of any grocery store or market, that contains a molecule capable of pressing the switch responsible for the birth of new insulin-producing cells. But trigonelline is only the first mechanism. And fenugreek is only the first seed. Because if we build a protocol around a single molecule, we repeat the same mistake. One drug, one pathway, one switch. But the pancreas is not one switch. It's an entire panel. And it has 4 entry points, 4 distinct pathways through which its capacity for regeneration can be influenced. The first entry, PDX1 and trigonelline. We already know this. Fenugreek seeds, activated transcription factor, stimulated neogenesis. These are the gates. The second entry, and here fenugreek appears again, but through a different molecule. Galactomannan, a polysaccharide contained in the inner endosperm of the seed. This is not a drug. It's a structure. Soluble fiber that forms a gel-like mass in the small intestine and physically slows glucose absorption. Imagine, you've eaten breakfast, and instead of sugar striking the bloodstream as a powerful wave, forcing your exhausted pancreas to throw every remaining worker onto the assembly line simultaneously, galactomannan transforms the wave into a smooth, steady flow. Fewer spikes. Less burden. Less oxidative stress on the beta cells that remain. A Penn State study in 2011 showed that adding 15 grams of fenugreek to the daily diet reduced the postprandial glycemic peak by an average of 23% over 8 weeks. 23%, simply from physically changing the rate of absorption. The third entry, and this requires black seed. Nigella sativa, black cumin, kalonji, different cultures, different names, one molecule, thymoquinone. And thymoquinone is an agent that works through AMPK. AMP-activated protein kinase, an enzyme that activates during cellular energy stress and opens a side entrance for glucose uptake independent of insulin. Yes. Independent of insulin. When your exhausted factory can't keep up, AMPK unlocks an emergency door into the cell. Muscle tissue, liver, they begin absorbing glucose without waiting for the signal from the pancreas. A 2019 NIH study showed that thymoquinone reliably increased AMPK activity in skeletal muscle cells and improved insulin sensitivity in people with metabolic syndrome, with no dietary changes other than the addition of 2 grams of seed per day. The fourth entry, and here we need flax and chia, is the NF-kappa B pathway. Nuclear factor kappa B, NF-kappa B, is perhaps the most consequential inflammatory signal in the context of diabetes. It governs the production of pro-inflammatory cytokines, which, And here is the Achilles heel of beta cells, are selectively toxic to the pancreatic islets. Beta cells are more sensitive to cytokine-driven inflammation than almost any other cell type in the body. And when NF-kappa B is chronically activated, and it is chronically activated in type 2 diabetes, the factory burns with a quiet, unceasing fire. The lignans in flax seed and the omega-3 alpha-linolenic acid in chia seeds both suppress the NF-kappa B pathway. Not completely. Not like dexamethasone. But enough to reduce background inflammation. Enough to make a few of those vacant positions on the factory floor viable again for new beta cells. The Karolinska Institute published data in 2020 showing that a diet enriched with plant-based omega-3 reduced markers of IL-1 beta, one of the primary executors of NF-kappa B-driven inflammation, by 31% over 12 weeks in patients with prediabetes. And, yes, 4 pathways. 4 agents. 1 factory. But now stop and think about something else. I just described 4 distinct molecular mechanisms. And not one of them is a pharmaceutical drug. Not one is manufactured by a pharmaceutical company. Not one requires a prescription, insurance coverage, or a clinical referral. They grow in the ground. They're sold in every major grocery store. They cost almost nothing. And how many of the people walking out of an endocrinologist's office today with a new prescription, did anyone tell them? Before we move to the protocol, write in the comments, did your doctor ever speak with you about the role of nutrition in restoring pancreatic function, or only about controlling blood sugar levels? I'm genuinely asking. Now, the protocol. I want you to read this part slowly. Not because it's complicated, but because it's specific. And specificity here matters more than any amount of motivation. Morning. Always morning. Not because there's magic in the early hours, but because chronobiology is real. Insulin sensitivity is highest in the first half of the day, and that is precisely when your factory is most responsive to input. The first step happens the night before. 2 teaspoons of whole fenugreek seeds, whole, not ground, soaked in a glass of warm water. Cover the glass. Leave it overnight. By morning the seeds have swollen, the water has become slightly viscous, that is the galactomannan that has moved into solution. You drink the water and chew the seeds on an empty stomach. The taste is slightly bitter, with a faint nutty note. You get used to it. Your factory has already received its signal. 20 minutes later, breakfast. And into breakfast you add 1 tablespoon of freshly ground flaxseed. Freshly ground, this matters, because lignans and omega-3 oxidize quickly. A coffee grinder, 10 seconds, and it's done. Stir into yogurt, oatmeal, anything you like. 1 tablespoon, and the NF-kappa B pathway has its counteragent. 5 minutes after that, if you have chia seeds, 1 teaspoon of seeds that have been soaking in water. They've already expanded into a small gelatinous pudding. You can mix them into water with a squeeze of lemon, or blend them into a smoothie. The alpha-linolenic acid is already diffusing across the intestinal wall. AMPK pathways in your muscles are already receiving support. Black seed, the least appetizing participant of the protocol, and honesty requires admitting that. The flavor is sharp, somewhere between cumin and black pepper. But 2 grams is less than half a teaspoon. You can swallow it with water, stir it into tea, mix it with a small amount of honey. The only requirement is consistency. Because thymoquinone accumulates its effect over time, it does not deliver an immediate strike. That is the entire morning ritual. 15 minutes. 4 seeds. 4 pathways toward recovery. And the first morning when fasting glucose finally drops, people who have followed this protocol describe it not as a victory over disease. They describe it as the first moment they felt that their body was on their side. But there are mistakes. And I am obligated to name them, because without this the picture is incomplete. The first and most common, inconsistency. Trigonelline and thymoquinone do not produce an acute effect. They work through accumulated signaling, through repeated PDX1 activation, through the gradual suppression of NF-kappa B. If you begin, skip 3 days, begin again, the mechanism never consolidates. Minimum 8 consecutive weeks to see changes in markers. Most people stop at week 4. Not because it isn't working, because they haven't felt it yet. And because they haven't felt it, they conclude it doesn't work. The second mistake, ground fenugreek powder instead of whole seeds. Galactomannan is a structural molecule. It is contained within the cell wall of the seed and releases slowly during soaking. If you use powder, most of the galactomannan has already degraded during processing. You need whole seeds and an overnight bath in water. The third, expecting the seeds to compensate for everything else. They cannot. If your diet remains the diet that created the situation, no seed will pull upstream against that current. Trigonelline activates PDX1, but if the beta cells born through neogenesis immediately enter an environment of chronic glucolipotoxicity, they die again. This is not magic. It is chemistry. And chemistry requires conditions. The fourth, exceeding the recommended dose. 5 teaspoons of fenugreek instead of 2 does not produce a better effect, it produces digestive distress and breaks adherence to the protocol. Efficacy here is not linear. And, finally, the fifth and quietest mistake, waiting for someone else to tell you it's alright. For a doctor to approve it, for family to support it, for some external validation to grant you permission to begin. But no one will grant you permission. No one sat in those emergency rooms and saw what I saw. No one carries responsibility for your pancreas except you. I want to say something directly, without softening, but also without cruelty. Type 2 diabetes is not a DNA sentence. Yes, genetic predisposition plays a role. But genes are a loaded gun. The trigger is years. Years of nutrition, inflammation, metabolic load, without response to the early signals. And if years shape the situation, years can shift it. Not back to 20. Not to a full restoration of lost tissue. But to slow the fire. To give the factory a chance to hire new workers. To reduce the load on those who remain. This is not a triumph. It is a choice. Your pancreas is not finished. Your beta cells have not all disappeared. The reserve trainees in the tissue are still waiting for a signal. And now you know what that signal can look like: 2 teaspoons of seeds soaked in a glass of water last night. I thought about this protocol for a long time before I began speaking about it publicly. Because I know exactly how seeds for diabetes sounds to a serious clinician. But then I thought again about those rooms. About the man without his foot. About the woman on dialysis. About everything that could have been slowed if someone had spoken sooner. If not me, then who? What would you have done if you had known this 10 years ago? I am not asking you to stop your treatment. I am not asking you to ignore your doctor. I am asking you to raise a question that most people never ask: what if, alongside what the system prescribed, there is something else, studied, documented, available, that the system simply hasn't incorporated into its protocols yet? What happens when a person learns that their body has not broken down for good? Picture this: you walk into an ordinary grocery store. Past the meat section, past the dairy aisle, past the checkout line. And there, a small shelf of spices and seeds. You've walked past that bag 1,000 times. Brown seeds, unremarkable font, a price that rounds to the nearest dollar. You used to look right through it. Today you see it differently. You see PDX1. You see galactomannan. You see a quiet, persistent signal traveling from your intestine to your pancreas, and there, within the cellular tissue of the islets of Langerhans, something stirs. Not instantly. Not loudly. But it stirs. Your factory is still running. The fire can be slowed. New workers can be hired. And you already know what the first shift begins with.